Hello, everyone, and happy May to you. It's May 1st, 20, and we are 0 games into the year in Major League Baseball. It's the first day of May, and one of the things I thought to look at before I talk about this week's column in the Daily Herald, my Go Figure column, is to look at what was happening 100 years ago on this day. On this day, 100 years ago, May 1st, 1920, Babe Ruth hit the first home run of his Yankee career. He'd been traded from the Red Sox in the offseason for a bunch of money. It was part of the curse of the Bambino that we all have heard about. That 84 years later is when the Red Sox finally won. It was 86 years after their last pennant in 1918 that Babe Ruth was so essential in winning for them when he was just a 23-year-old ball player at that time. And so on this day, he had a home run off of Herb Pennock. Herb later went to the Hall of Fame, was inducted in 1948, the same year that Pennock died, same year that Babe Ruth passed away on August 16th. In addition, Herb Pennock, as you may or may not know, was the father-in-law of Eddie Collins, another Hall of Famer, 3,000 hits and so on. So a lot tied up in that, but Ruth had gone the entire month of April, it was only about 9 games back then, without hitting a home run. When he hit his home run, the league lead in the American League was two home runs. 5 people had 2 home runs at that time. In the National League, there was someone who had 2 home runs. And by the end of May, Ruth had 12 home runs. No one else in the majors had more than 6. And so pretty crazy to think about how quickly Ruth took off that year, ended with 54 home runs. And it was in only 458 at-bats. That's a home run every 8.5 at-bats. His home run power ratio, which is to say his frequency of hitting home runs compared to the rest of the American League, that's the basis of comparison for him, was 15.54, meaning he was 15.5 times more likely to hit a home run than anyone else, the typical American leaguer that year. Crazy off-the-charts performance. And so when he hit 60 home runs, that was in 540 at-bats, that was a home run every 9 at-bats, and his home run power ratio that year was 12.1. All that to say is Bambino was clearly head and shoulders above his contemporaries. So any comparisons that people make about sluggers today or in the last generation or two have to take that all into account. That Ruth was revolutionary. He hit more home runs than entire teams. Most American League teams didn't hit as many home runs as he did. And it also shows the greatness of people like Lou Gehrig. When Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs, Gehrig had 47. Nobody else had as many as 20 home runs that year. And so I'm pretty sure in that last stat, I'm doing this all from memory. And by the way, retrosheet.org is the source for me knowing a lot of the specifics of these numbers, this day in history type stuff. Amazing. By the way, the Yankees were 5-7 after that game on May 1st, 1920. They were lower in the rankings really early on, though. They had 142 games left. They ended up winning the pennant, winning the World Series. Back then, teams would just win their league and they straight to the World Series. They rarely did a World Series go beyond the 10th day of October, 15th at the very latest, and nowadays, obviously, we go into November. Just some things to think about in terms of the differences. We didn't even have any playoffs until 1969. That's when the Mets beat the Braves in the National League, and in the American League, the Orioles were victorious over the Twins when we broke it up into 2 divisions for each league. So it's always about context. You know, one of the things I'm a big believer in is understanding what does this number mean in the context of history, in context of other teams, other things going on at the time. So, by the way, I'm wearing today my Sports Jeopardy hat. It's kind of a special moment. Today is actually, yesterday was the 5th anniversary of me getting the phone call from Sports Jeopardy from an assistant producer saying, "Hey, Matt, can you come on out and be on the show?" And I was. About 3 weeks later, I flew out, and Dan Patrick hosted it. I went up against 2 other sports nuts. I came in 2nd place. Spoiler alert, too late for that. I was in 3rd, and then I surged into 1st place late, and then the guy that had been 1st place pretty much the whole time, he retook the lead right before Final Jeopardy. I ended up in 2nd place, and it was a surreal experience. I made $2,000, ended up having to pay $140 to California. They tax 7%, so it's down to $1,860, which when you think about Illinois in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, one of our great Americans who lived most of his life in Illinois after being born in Kentucky and a little bit of time in Indiana, He was elected U.S. president, and clearly the scope of history changed from there. So there's a lot more to life than sports, of course, but that's why you probably clicked on this link. We're 5 minutes in. Let me talk about the upcoming column that is going to appear in the Daily Herald on May 3rd, this coming Sunday. It's on Chicago Cubs uniforms. Last week, I wrote about White Sox uniforms and the history of different players who wore different numbers. And this week, it's going to be about Cubs players. The Daily Herald is here in Chicago. It's a terrific newspaper that's been around for, you know what? I don't know that exact fact, but they've been around for a long time. When I got out of college 30 years ago, the Daily Herald was one of the top papers. It still is. And I've had the good fortune of freelancing for them on occasion over time. So let's get right to a few of the questions for this week with the Cubs. 1932 was the first year that Cubs players had uniforms. And so, that Cubs players had numbers on the uniforms. And that was basically how it went across the board in the major leagues. There's some variations where some players had numbers here and there before that, but this is the first full-fledged year. And so from 1932 onward, so we're talking about 88 years, there have been close to 2,000 players for the Cubs with different uniform numbers. Now, it's 1955, but some of those are the same player counted a few times because players would shift uniforms. For instance, Ron Santo, he wore number 10, but he wasn't always wearing number 10. He had a different number that he also wore along the way. That's not actually even a question for this week. There's six Cubs whose numbers have been retired, but it's only 5 numbers because 2 pitchers both wore number 31. So that's one of the questions. Both of those pitchers are in the Hall of Fame. One came close to 300 wins. One went well over 300, in fact, over 350 wins in his career. Both had amazing control. One had 3,000 strikeouts plus with just a little bit over 1,000 walks, I believe he issued. The other one had just a few under 1,000 walks that he issued. Great control, great precision for these players. So let me see, recalling from my research earlier this week, a question that would be of interest. And so here we go. Let me talk about 1958 to 1966. Number 17 was worn by 4 players in that span, all of whom went on to manage in the major leagues. As I was looking through the list of all the different players for many of the numbers, I didn't look through all 74 numbers that are represented among Cub uniforms over the years. I noticed this. I was like, I know this guy was the manager, this guy. I'm pretty sure that guy too. And so I did a little more looking in. Yes, all 4 of those guys who wore 17 in succession went on to manage in the major leagues. In fact, the first one to wear it went on to manage within a few years for the Giants. He was a former Rookie of the Year, Alvin Dark. Alvin Dark was the first number 17 in that sequence to wear 17 who went on to manage. The next player to wear 17 was Don Zimmer. Zimmer went on to manage a bunch of teams, including the Cubs and my beloved Red Sox. And along the way, he managed Texas Rangers, New York Yankees a little bit when Joe Torre needed some time off. And he also managed the San Diego Padres. And I think I'm forgetting one team that Zimmer managed. But moving on, the next player was Steve Boros. Steve Boros, number 17 for the Cubs in 63-64 timeframe. He went on to manage the Oakland A's and San Diego Padres. Not very long, but he did it. And then the next player wearing number 17 was Joey Amalfitano. And Amalfitano managed the Cubs briefly in the early 80s. And between Boros and Amalfitano, very short tenures. Meanwhile, Zimmer and Dark both came close to winning 1,000 games as managers. They both had above 500 records. The other 2 had below 500. Cumulatively, all of them combined were 9 games below 500 as managers. But the amazing thing that jumped out at me as I was looking at this list was, wow, all these guys managed, and I didn't do exhaustive research to see every single number for the Cubs, but I gotta believe that that's the longest string in a row of players for the Cubs wearing the same uniform number who went on to be major league managers. And all but one of them managed the San Diego Padres. Something I also noticed in looking through each of their records. And the answer to that question is, who did not manage the Padres? Joey Amalfitano. So Boris did at the end of his pretty short tenure. Zimmer managed the Padres at the beginning of his time in the early 70s. He managed the Padres before his next job was with the Red Sox as a manager. And then Alvin Dark at the end of his career. He managed the Giants in the early 60s. He went on to manage the Oakland A's. He managed a few other teams, but he ended up with the Padres, the Giants as well. I believe Alvin Dark managed. I could be wrong on that. So, well, he managed them early in his career. So that's my meandering May 1st, 2020. But I hope you found it of interest. Retrosheet.org is an amazing resource that I highly recommend for research for anyone that wants to go down into the rabbit holes of players' careers and team histories and play-by-play. It's a volunteer-driven website led by David Smith, who I had the pleasure of interviewing and writing a feature about 20 years ago. And you can find that online. Just type in David Smith, Matt Barron, Retro Sheet. You'll come across the story that I had the good fortune of writing for the University of Delaware College magazine. David was a microbiology professor there. And so this is a passion project he's done with Retro Sheet for years. I also had the opportunity to write a very short story for Time magazine on Retro Sheet somewhere around 2002, 03. It was all of 60 words, but it was had my byline at the bottom, which I like to say that my byline represented 5% of the entire piece. I got to believe it was very well read. It didn't take more than 10 seconds for people to read it, but it was just something that I had the opportunity to do and seize that opportunity. So another great resource is Baseball Reference. If you go to baseball-reference.com, type in team uniforms or type in any team name, baseball uniform history, Google will pop up the link to that team on Baseball Reference, and you can do this kind of research if you are so moved. So as we enter this new month during this coronavirus era, I wish everyone well and take care, and looking forward to the return of baseball safely and securely. Take care.